Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute, albeit remotely, to this important ancillary meeting on life imprisonment, which UNODC is very pleased to co-sponsor. Let me start my brief intervention by concurring with previous speakers that the increasing resort to life imprisonment, even more so if it takes the form of life without parole, raises serious concerns about what I would say three fundamental issues. The first of these issues being the ultimate purpose of a sentence of imprisonment and its expected aim to also further the social reintegration prospects of prisoners. Secondly, I think we will need to talk about issues around the human dignity of prisoners, in particular in light of the impact of an indeterminate sentence on individuals sentenced to life. And thirdly, I would argue that there is a lot to be said about the practical challenges associated with the actual management of this particular category of long-term prisoners. Now, let me be clear that these concerns remain despite the fact that reform efforts in this particular field are obviously difficult in light of the serious nature of the crimes that carry life sentences, in particular homicide. With the exception of children, for whom life imprisonment without the possibility of release is explicitly banned under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, we do not yet have a dedicated UN standard on the resort to life imprisonment or the treatment of those serving a life sentence. This does not mean, however, that we cannot turn to existing international standards for explicit guidance. Life imprisonment now constitutes the most severe penal sanction available in a vast majority of member states, and it would seem plausible and logical that international standards applicable to those that may have faced the death penalty prior to its abolition should at least be relevant to those who are now facing a life sentence. And this means, very importantly, a call to restrict such sentences to the most serious crimes and to not go beyond crimes with lethal or other extremely grave consequences. Now, as far as the management of prisoners sentenced to life is concerned, I would like to make a strong point that the Nelson Mandela rules, this crucial set of universally acknowledged minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners, do not in any way exclude prisoners sentenced to life from their scope of application. The Nelson Mandela rules and their focus on preserving the human dignity of prisoners apply to all prisoners. Next to humane treatment, however, I would also like to draw your attention to two further principles embodied in the Nelson Mandela rules, with the first being the requirement that prison administrations should not aggravate the suffering which is inherent in a situation of imprisonment. I would say this is of particular importance here, as it is hard to overestimate the severe impact which the fact of serving an indeterminate prison sentence alone has on individuals. We are talking about a severe risk of isolation, desocialization, the loss of personal responsibility, and an ever-increasing risk of institutionalization, meaning the progressive loss of one's ability to lead an autonomous and constructive life outside of the prison environment. What we should equally draw attention to, however, when we discuss life imprisonment is the principle of individualization. As for all prisoners, the regime in which a prisoner sentenced to life is to be held should be continuously determined on the basis of individual risk and needs assessments. Now, what do these principles mean in practice? From a security and safety perspective, we would argue that these principles clearly speak against imposing harsh conditions, highly restricted prison regimes, solitary confinement, or the automatic separation from other prisoners merely on the grounds of a prisoner serving a life sentence. From a treatment perspective, I would argue that these principles strongly suggest the continued involvement of prisoners sentenced to life in constructive activities and rehabilitation programs which are offered to other prisoners, ranging from education, vocational training and work, to programs aimed at addressing root causes of offending. Even more, I would probably take it even a step further by recommending that prisoners sentenced to life should be explicitly recognized as a category of prisoners with special needs, which derive from the very nature of their sentence, and who should therefore benefit from targeted efforts to counter social isolation, despair, and institutionalization. Now, as early as 1994, UNODC issued a first report on life imprisonment, in which a lot of these issues, which I can just briefly touch upon during this presentation, are outlined in further detail. Very importantly, however, this report includes an explicit call for dedicated bodies authorized to review the progress of life sentence prisoners and, if appropriate, to recommend or grant release or remission. For example, after a fixed minimum time period as may be prescribed per national law. At this point, this possibility of a release, I think, is crucial when we talk about life imprisonment. And it leads us back to what the Nelson Mandela rules consider as the very purpose of a sentence of imprisonment, namely to protect society from crime and to reduce recidivism by preparing prisoners for their social reintegration into society. It is interesting to note that at regional level, the European Court for Human Rights has formalized its position in this regard, in the form that the prohibition of torture and ill treatment requires a reducibility of a prison sentence in the form of regular reviews undertaken by competent national authorities. We do not have such explicit provision at international level yet, but it would seem very plausible to us that in terms of international standards, the Nelson Mandela rule's clear and strong emphasis on the rehabilitation and social reintegration of all prisoners would point to a similar direction. With this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to continuing our joint efforts to draw attention to the particular challenges associated with the resort to and the actual implementation of long-term and life imprisonment. I wish you a fruitful exchange and look forward to learning about your subsequent discussions. Thank you very much.